Hello dolls and welcome back to another video. Today I want to travel through time with you once again, all the years back to the 1960s when on a cold October 31st, Halloween was a one-of-a-kind happening. Today I want to talk about Halloween in the 1960s. Everything from the costumes, to the parties, to the food, to the traditions. I would like to invite you to spend a Halloween with me in the 1960s. So before I want to talk about Halloween in the 1960s, I thought it was kind of interesting to take a brief look back on where Halloween came from and how it became such a popular and beloved holiday. The traditions of Halloween date back to the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain, which took place about 2,000 years ago. The Celtics believed that Samhain or Samhain, I found different ways on how to pronounce this, was the day in the year when the gap between our world and the spirit world was blurred, making it easier for the spirits of the dead to return. To commemorate the day, they would build huge bonfires, wear costumes, and tell fortunes. Over many years, as the Romans conquered much of Europe and Christianity spread into Celtic lands, the traditions of these beliefs and cultures blended. Bobbing for apples is thought to come from the Romans' worship of Pomona, the goddess of fruit and trees. The symbol of Pomona being the apple. Eventually, the Christian festival of All Saints or All Souls Day, otherwise known as All Hallows, took over the night before, which is called All Hallows Eve, leading to the now famous name Halloween. Trick-or-treating began hundreds of years ago in medieval England, when people would go door to door, offering a prayer or a song in exchange for food. This was known back then as souling, taking place on All Saints' Day when Christians would traditionally pray for their loved ones. Approaching the Victorian era, the food often given was a type of pastry called a soul cake, something somewhat resembling a biscuit or cake. Only recently in modern times has that tradition evolved into sweets and chocolates. The Celts were also the ones starting the tradition of costuming. Spooky outfits were worn to scare away any evil spirits lurking in the shadows of the celebrations. Pumpkins, however, that's a truly American thing. Though it has nowadays spread all over the world, this is something that started in modern-day America. It was brought over to the US by the Irish in the 19th century when many immigrated to America. Whereas back home they used to carve faces into turnips, they found pumpkins were easier to grow in America. So the tradition evolved to carving the pumpkins we are now all familiar with. Creepy faces would be carved into the vegetable to scare away a mythical spirit called Jack. Over the next decades, Halloween gained popularity, becoming a beloved holiday and tradition in the US. Costumes, decorations, and music changed, but at the core, Halloween remained the same. So let's talk about Halloween in the 1960s, starting with the costumes. Of course, whatever is trending in the media becomes a trend for the masses. So by the late 1950s, pinup-inspired Halloween costumes gained popularity. The 1950s and 60s led to a rise of the middle class that brought a stronger income. And by the mid-1960s, almost every American family was able to afford a television set. Because of that, consumer interests in dressing up as TV characters increased immensely during the decade. Cowboys and Western costumes were really popular in the 1950s and all throughout the 1960s because there were so many Western shows airing at the time. The 1950s also led to some pretty cool costume innovations, such as the vacuum-formed latex mask. Thanks to this technology, celebrity and politician masks were soon gaining popularity. And of course, the Beatles were the most popular ones. The 1960s was also the time of second wave feminism, leading to a rise of more sexual costumes in line with the times. In 1966, Julie Newmar made her debut as Catwoman in the Batman TV series, which inspired many other women to don Halloween catsuits. But generally speaking, it wasn't until the late 1960s and 1970s that risky costumes really took off, all thanks to the sexual revolution and changing ideals of modesty and fashion. When it came to the question of what to wear, the sky truly was the limit. While a lot of families still made their own costumes throughout the 1960s, there was a growing trend that had begun in the 1950s towards buying ready-made costumes that reflected popular culture, especially in the US and UK. The costume manufacturer Ben Cooper, for example, had been designing costumes since the 1930s, but it was throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s that the brand became somewhat of a household name and definitely synonymous with Halloween in the US. One of Ben Cooper's best-selling costumes in 1964 was of course the Beatles. Particularly George Harrison was a bestseller. The costume was released just in time for Halloween, following the band's rise to fame in America. Popular Halloween costumes, like those of Ben Cooper, can often act as snapshots of popular culture of the time. And so the 1964 popular Beatles costumes perfectly capture the moment in music history when the Beatles took America and Beatlemania was born. Costume options in the 1960s got even more expansive as popular culture solidified further. Beloved choices were the Addams Family and Flipper the Dolphin, but also the Beatles and Barbie. Whether ready-made, buying a pattern, or completely making your outfit from scratch, popular costumes of the decades included Superman, Rocky, and Bullwinkle, Spider-Man, the Beatles, Casper the Friendly Ghost, and of course the traditional costumes of the Mummy, the Witch, the Black Cat, or the classic Ghost. The 1950s saw a rise in Halloween parties, and by the 1960s, they were a must for everyone. This led to many musicians releasing spooky-inspired tunes to be played at those parties. No Halloween parties in the 1960s would have been complete without the spooky hit Monster Mash, which was released by Bobby Boris Pickett and the Crypt Kickers in 1962. The single hit #1 on the US Billboard Hot 100 that October and has remained a classic ever since. The song was re-released in 1973 and peaked at #3 in the UK once again. The making of the song is actually quite interesting. Several tricks were used for the sound effects in Monster Mash, including blowing through a straw into water to simulate the sound of a boiling cauldron. This same trick would actually later be used by the Beatles in their song Yellow Submarine. The 1960s also saw an increase in the appeal of the horror film, which of course coincided with the boom of Halloween. Watching horror films on Halloween became a new tradition, and iconic horror films like Psycho and The Birds were a must. Both films were directed by the iconic British director Alfred Hitchcock, of whom George Harrison also was a big fan. In 1963, the year that The Birds was released, George gave an interview saying he liked driving, television, sleeping, Chet Atkins, Eggs and Chips, Eartha Kitt, and Alfred Hitchcock movies. Psycho, released in 1960, inspired the Beatles song Eleanor Rigby. The film's notorious score by Bernard Herrmann convinced Paul McCartney that classical strings could work in any song. And so he handed the score to producer George Martin, who brought Paul's concept to life in the 1966 song. But films weren't the only thing people were watching. Television shows like The Addams Family, The Munsters, or Bewitched were perfect for Halloween nights. But even shows that weren't inertly spooky started picking up Halloween themes, like for example, It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. I actually did my makeup today inspired by Lily Munster of The Munsters. I really think that this is such a great TV show, and I love how spooky became so popular in the 1960s. As a kid obsessed with vampires, The Fearless Vampire Killers by Roman Polanski has been one of my favorite movies ever since my childhood. I was just really in love with witches, vampires, and all of that, and The Munsters really fell into that category. I kind of kept my love for old school horror films, and I would like to continue by talking another one of my all-time favorites. Because in the 1960s, many also loved reading horror novels, and Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin became a bestseller, selling over 4 million copies. The novel, released in 1967, was so popular that it became a catalyst for the so-called horror boom and was even adapted for a universally acclaimed movie by Roman Polanski, which is since then considered one of the greatest horror films of all times, and I would definitely agree with that. The spine-chilling novel behind Polanski's eponymous 1968 film, Rosemary's Baby, plunges the reader into a world of terrifying dreams, paranoia, and devilry in an old New York City apartment building. Was written in the Waterstones papers about it. Parties started reaching new heights in the 1960s, and many wanted everything to be Halloween themed, from the music to the decor, and you guessed it, the food. I found this magazine ad from Bragg's, and it shows some of the most popular sweets and candy from the time, including the very popular and beloved candy corn. Candy corn was actually already invented in the 1880s and became synonymous with autumn and Halloween in the 1950s and 60s. Other popular treats in the US included Swedish fish, sweet tarts, fruit stripes, and the intriguing playable wax harmonica by Glen Confections Inc. The concept of trick-or-treating was seen as a very American thing for most of the 1960s, and it would take several years for this tradition to take on the world. Here's a little fact about me. I grew up in Germany where Halloween is still celebrated, but you only dress up in spooky costumes because there's a holiday called Fasching in February where everyone dresses up as whatever they want. And the history of Fasching is very close to the history of Halloween, with the whole idea of scaring evil spirits away. Yes, adults loved mingling at Halloween parties, but in the 1960s, Halloween was that one special evening that truly belonged to the kids. The streets in autumn, strewn with fallen leaves of varying colors, were quite magical, and the feeling of fall and the Halloween spirit stayed with many all through the month of October. October was the month where in many places the weather turned much colder, and the scent of neighboring fireplaces filled the air. On cold days when noses ran and the season's chill kept creeping down the back of everyone's neck, like ghostly skeleton fingers, it was still fun to play outside. October was a special month, especially because it brought Halloween. It was a wonderful time of the year where monsters, ghosts, candy, and festivities all came together on one fantastic night. The days grew shorter and precious sunlight began to fade slowly, but it didn't matter because October signaled the approach of the holiday season. Once Halloween ended, Thanksgiving followed, leading into Christmas, the most cherished holiday to recall. Schools started recognizing Halloween as something special, and teachers would often assign creative tasks or organize unique Halloween activities. Halloween at school was never about the evil or anything corrupt, but rather a simple, joyous celebration of the fall season. It was a time for childhood innocence and nothing more. Sometimes a teacher would read a short story or have each student share details about their costumes. So this last bit that I just shared with you was kind of like a concoction of a couple of blog entries I found from people who lived through Halloween in the 1960s and how they experienced fall and Halloween, and it just seems like such a dreamy time. But let's get back to the costumes. The sensation of cheap, thin plastic masks commonly sold at grocery stores during Halloween is for many 1960s kids still unforgettable. Masks of pirates, witches, ghosts, skulls, and superheroes hung from store shelves by their elastic bands. Every year, parents would ask their children what they wanted to be, and a new mask would make its way into the grocery cart. Wearing the mask, however, often became quite uncomfortable. They were hot, sweaty, and made breathing quite difficult. For young children, the masks would hang awkwardly, obscuring their vision as they navigated trick-or-treating, peering through small eye holes while collecting candy. Neighborhoods were often home to haunted houses, usually close by, and steeped in eerie legends about former residents. Theirs to pass these haunted houses became a Halloween tradition, adding an extra layer of thrill and fear to the night. The experience truly wouldn't have been the same without the creeping terror these houses evoked. Paid haunted houses were something pretty new in the 1960s, but they started to gain a lot of popularity over the decades. These structured experiences guided visitors through dark hallways and tight spaces, heightening the sense of suspense. As children, many tried to recreate their own haunted houses to scare their friends, though the results were often limited to a single haunted room. A clever trick was hanging fishing wire from the ceiling to mimic cobwebs. True haunted houses scares, though, came from well-timed jumps by disguised figures, monsters, or creatures who blended into the scenery before lunging just at the right time to startle an unsuspecting visitor. In 1960, photographer George Silk shot a Halloween-themed photo series for the Life magazine. He made the images using an adapted version of the camera design used to capture photo finishes at athletic races. These images captured what Halloween was like in the 1960s perfectly. They were printed with these words: Lock your doors, stuff the keyholes, don't even let a wisp of wind under the door sill. On Halloween, a ghost can come on a draft. A witch can seep through a cranny as easily as her crackle can. Listen, was that a knocking? Only a trickster, you say, wrapped up in a shroud and bent on a treat. Or masked imposters caught by a camera with a crooked lens. Open the door and see for yourself what might await you on Halloween. In the 1960s, Halloween costumes were a blend of classic monsters, pop culture figures, and homemade creativity. The rise of mass-produced costumes made it easier for kids to dress up as their favorite characters, while makeup was often used for spooky looks or to enhance a put-together last-minute or not-so-well-turning-out home-soon costume. But over the decade, makeup really became a new thing for many to try and play with on Halloween nights. So now that you saw so many pictures, I would like to tell you a little more about the most popular costume choices of the decade. Starting with TV and cartoon characters. Characters from popular TV shows and cartoons were a major influence thanks to the rise of television. That included superheroes like Batman, especially after the 1966 TV show aired, Superman, and characters from the Looney Tunes or the Flintstones. Casper the Friendly Ghost was another Halloween favorite for many younger kids. Just as they are nowadays, Disney characters Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, and Disney princesses like Snow White or Cinderella were popular, especially with the re-releases of Disney movies in the 1960s. Universal monster movies were still hugely influential, so costumes like Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Mummy, and the Wolfman were Halloween staples. These classic characters never went out of style, even though they originated from several decades earlier. A perennial Halloween favorite, witches often completed with pointy heads, warts, I should have maybe done that, and brooms were a common costume for both adults and kids. Vampires, ghouls, and other supernatural entities were a common choice for many, often reflecting the earlier described popularity of horror films. Simple yet effective, many opted for the classic ghost costume, often just a sheet with cutout eyes, or skeleton suits, for a spooky traditional Halloween look. Inspired by the space rage of the 1960s, astronaut costumes became very popular. Kids would often dress up in spacesuits, reflecting the cultural fascination with space exploration and science fiction. The Jetsons and other futuristic characters also played into this trend. I said it before and I say it again, in the 1960s you truly cannot escape space age. A common homemade costume was the hobo or tramp. This typically involved ragged clothes, a knapsack on a stick, and smudged makeup to resemble dirt or stubble. It was a simple, affordable, and creative costume idea for many families. The 1960s also saw kids and adults dressing as political figures like John F. Kennedy or Lyndon B. Johnson. This also extended to figures from the civil rights movement and counterculture icons. I quickly want to note here that the tradition of dressing up for Halloween has a long history of blackface. I would like to issue a little trigger warning here. I'm going to share a couple of pictures of people in blackface. I think it is important to acknowledge this and how wrong it was, but because it was a part of Halloween, I thought it was really important to address it in this video. Blackface has its roots in 19th century minstrel shows, where white performers would darken their skin with makeup to portray exaggerated, stereotyped caricatures of African Americans. These performances mocked black people, reinforcing racist attitudes and perpetuating harmful stereotypes. Blackface became popular in American entertainment, including in theater and early Hollywood films, where it continued to marginalize black actors and culture. Though gladly there was a decline after World War II, blackface persisted in various forms, including in Halloween costumes and the media, all the way up until the 80s, and sadly every now and then you hear of people who just didn't hear the shot and are still doing this. In the 1960s, blackface remained a troubling aspect of American Halloween culture. Despite the growing civil rights movement and increased awareness of racial injustice, some people still wore blackface as a part of their costume, often portraying racist caricatures of African Americans. Blackface had been popularized in earlier decades through minstrel shows and Hollywood films. And while it began to decline, its lingering presence in Halloween costumes during the 1960s reflected a broader racial insensitivity. At the same time, African American activists and allies were challenging these offensive depictions, calling for an end to blackface and other forms of racial mockery. As awareness of racial issues grew throughout the decade, dressing in blackface started to face increasing criticism, signaling a shift toward more socially conscious behavior. However, it would still take decades of activism and widespread societal rejection of blackface and Halloween culture to take hold. Group costumes like the Beatles or the Wizard of Oz were seen at a lot of 1960s Halloween parties. This could range from store-bought masks like the Beatles, who due to their licensing of practically everything were soon seen everywhere, to homemade costumes like the Lion or the Tin Man from the Wizard of Oz. As mentioned earlier, for adults, pin-up and sexier costumes were rising in popularity, and soon witches in fishnet tights, high-cut slits, or miniskirts were walking the streets. Movies like Barbarella had a certain sex appeal many women wanted to have for their Halloween parties, so they started attending in these iconic costumes. In the 1960s, Halloween masks were a key part of many costumes and came in various forms, from mass-produced plastic versions to homemade or paper masks. Plastic masks were mass-produced and widely sold in stores like grocery stores, drugstores, and five and dime shops, such as Woolworths. They were often packaged with matching vinyl costumes depicting the character's outfit. These masks were thin, brightly colored, and often had simple details, featuring popular characters like Batman, Superman, or Casper the Friendly Ghost. But also, horror icons like Dracula, Frankenstein, and witches were also quite common. As the decade progressed, pop culture celebrities like the Beatles were bestsellers too. These masks were secured with a thin elastic band and had small holes for breathing and vision. They were notorious for being uncomfortable, hot, sweaty, and difficult to see through. Popular brands included Ben Cooper, Collegeville, and Helco, which produced a wide array of costumes based on film, TV, and cartoon characters. If you didn't like the plastic mask, you could also opt for a paper one. Many paper masks were available through magazine inserts or mail-to-order catalogs. Popular children's magazines sometimes included cutout masks for Halloween. These would often be themed around cartoon characters or comic strips. Paper masks were also a popular DIY project for many kids, who would cut out masks from construction paper or use templates found in magazines. These homemade masks allowed for more creativity with decorations like crayons, paint, or glued features like yarn or felt. Paper masks were more fragile than plastic ones and usually lasted for just one night of trick-or-treating. However, they offered a cheap and easy way to participate in the holiday festivities. For those who prefer to get creative, homemade masks were common. These could be made from a variety of materials found around the house, like paper, cardboard, fabric, or even paper mache. Families would often use simple materials like old pillowcases or construction paper to fashion unique masks for Halloween. Homemade masks ranged from simple face coverings like ghosts made from white sheets to more complex designs crafted with paint and scissors. Kids often personalized their masks to fit the rest of the costume. Most children and parents, though, purchased Halloween masks at local stores, where rags of plastic masks paired with vinyl costumes were popular items in October. Magazine inserts, especially in children's publications, often featured free paper mask templates, allowing kids to cut, color, and decorate them just as they preferred at home. Additionally, mail-order catalogs offered costume sets that could be delivered straight to your door, which seemed so futuristic at the time. These masks captured the essence of Halloween in the 1960s, reflecting a mix of pop culture, creativity, and affordability. While plastic masks are often remembered for their discomfort, they are an iconic symbol of the era's Halloween celebrations. On the other hand, many children really adored making their own masks at home, allowing them to have full freedom with who they wanted to be for this special night. For those not liking face masks for practical or comfort reasons, face paint became a great option. For costumes like clowns, skeletons, and witches, basic grease paint and face paint were used. Clowns had white faces with exaggerated red lips and cheeks. Skeletons were created with black and white face paint, and witches often used green face paint. Companies like Ben Cooper and Collegeville didn't only produce Halloween costumes, but soon also sold grease paint kits for DIY makeup. These were essential for turning kids into monsters, ghosts, and superheroes. Parents also often got creative with items they had around the house. Charcoal, black eyeliner, or burnt corks were used to create mustaches, beards, and dirty faces for costumes like hobos, pirates, farmers, or cowboys. Fake blood, often made from household ingredients like corn syrup and food coloring, was used for vampire costumes or other spooky effects. This is a great tip. It still works, coming from someone who as a teenager shot a lot of horror films at home. I can tell you that this still is the cheapest and best way to make pretty decently looking fake blood. The only thing is it is insanely sticky and you will clean yourself and wherever you put it for the next decade. For those dressing as iconic monsters like Dracula or Frankenstein's monster, makeup played a big role. Frankenstein's monster would require green face paint, while Dracula often involved a pale skin with dark under-eye circles and drawn-on fangs with red lipstick or fake blood. By the late 1960s, makeup techniques were improving, and horror films began inspiring more elaborate makeup effects. People started experimenting with latex scars, rubber prosthetics, and more advanced techniques to give their costume a realistic and terrifying edge, a trend that would explode in the decades following. In short, the 1960s Halloween was a combination of playful TV and cartoon character costumes, classic horror icons, and space age or countercultural themes, all supported by the simple yet creative use of makeup. Grease paint kits were often sold for cheap at local shops. However, they sometimes contained harmful ingredients, as cosmetic regulations were way less strict in the 1960s. One of the biggest concerns was the presence of toxic heavy metals, like lead in face paint and makeup. The 1960s was a lead and asbestos-filled decade, just to tell you. To me, it is always insane to think that by the 1960s, this was already so much better than it was before. If you didn't know this, a lot of people who worked on the set, both on film and off camera, of The Wizard of Oz got really sick and died pretty young, and it is most likely due to all the lead paint and all the asbestos used in building that set, which is so scary when you think about it and the film. But it also was the norm, and in the 60s and 70s asbestos still was used for building and lead was still used a lot. I just did a lab testing last year of all of my vintage pots and came to find out that my family had been eating out of lead contaminated pots for ages, and also bowls. So I got rid of all of those. But I know that a lot of people would like to own some 1960s makeup, and trust me, I would too. Just don't use it. There is lead in it, and it's also so old and expired. Just do not put that on your skin. In the 1960s, some pigments contained harmful chemicals that could cause skin irritation, allergic reaction, or even long-term health issues. Lead-based products, particularly in bright reds and whites, were especially dangerous. There were also concerns about the use of coal tar dyes in makeup, which were known to be potentially harmful, but for some reason weren't forbidden. While widespread scandals and recalls weren't as common or publicized in the 1960s, as awareness of product safety and consumer protection was still evolving, there were occasional issues reported with unsafe products. Luckily, over time, these concerns led to stricter regulations on cosmetic by the FDA, particularly after the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, but enforcement was still developing during the era. By the 1960s and beyond, awareness around the dangers of these toxins grew, leading to better regulation, with recalls becoming more common as standards improved. Halloween is and always will be a reflection of the times. It seemed that in the 1960s, the holiday was simpler yet filled with so much wonder. From homemade costumes and store-bought masks to pillowcases full of candy and eerie neighborhood legends, Halloween was a night of innocent thrills and boundless excitement. Children ran through dimly lit streets with friends, their imagination as wild as the stories they heard about haunted houses or the next block's scariest yard display. Though times have changed, the magic of these Halloweens lingers in the hearts of those who lived through them, reminding us that the spirit of Halloween transcends decades, connecting generations through shared fright, joy, and nostalgia. So that is it for today's video. This was so much fun to make. I feel like I need to do more themed videos. I would love to know about all of your Halloween experiences, whether you got to live through it in the 1960s or 70s, or you're just living life like I am and you're always looking for that nostalgia of times you haven't even lived through. Yeah, this was so much fun to research, honestly. Halloween is such a wonderful time, as said earlier. I have such a love for these like old school classic horror films. Not a big fan of modern horror films because they terrify me, but something about these old ones is just so wonderful because they're not as gruesome and horrific, I think. I would also love to know what you are going to be for Halloween, and if you don't know it yet, don't be scared because on Wednesday I have another video coming for you where I will share popular 1960s Halloween costume ideas, and these are not how to dress up as someone from the 1960s, if that makes any sense. I feel like if you type in 60s costume in Google or something, it'll like show you horrendous and atrocious 1960s mod or hippie costumes. No, I am talking about what the people wore in the 1960s. A couple of hints could be something Rosemary's Baby related, something the original Addams Family related, everything on that kind of line. These are all really simple last minute ideas because I love to make do of what I have, but that video will come Wednesday night so that for Halloween you're all set to go. I hope you really enjoyed this video. If you did, I would love you to give it a thumbs up and maybe even share it with a friend. It supports me, it supports the channel, and it would truly mean the world. I hope you have a beautiful day. Go out, enjoy the witchy season, take yourself some time to focus on you, your mental health, and what you want to be for Halloween this year, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye, dolls!